Okay, so where do we start? My name's Nigel Colley. I live in the UK and I am the great nephew of Gareth Jones, who was the first named journalist to expose the 1932 genocide Holodomor. I never knew that I actually had a great uncle because he was murdered in 1935 and it must have been too distressful for the family to even mention him. And remember, after he exposed the famine in 1933, that he was rebuked by Foreign Commissar Litvinov because Litvinov had given him a private interview in Moscow, and then 2 weeks later, Gareth had exposed the famine, which was a great embarrassment to the Foreign Commissar because he was in delicate negotiations with the new American government of Roosevelt to have diplomatic relations. The Americans, they wanted to claw back old Tsarist debts, and in 1933, there was the Great Depression. They wanted to sell cars and tractors and produce. And the Soviets, what did they want? They wanted to have recognition to show that their regime had come of age. Gareth put a great huge spanner in the way, and the day after he exposed the famine in the world's newspapers in March 1933, the 31st of March, it went into front pages of American newspapers, the New York Post. It went to the Daily Express in London, which was the world's largest selling English language newspaper, on the front page. And it was a great embarrassment. But within one day, the world's highest paid journalist and the then Pulitzer Prize winner, Walter Duranty of the New York Times, basically called Gareth a liar and said, Russians hungry. Sorry, can I just stop there? I forget the name. Russians hungry, no famine. I need to look it up. Called him a liar in the New York Times, and because of his position, he was more widely believed. But Gareth was only 27, so why take the word of a 27-year-old who says millions are dying in the Soviet Union? Well, he worked as an aide to Lloyd George. Lloyd George was the First World War British Prime Minister. And they didn't say Gareth Jones says millions dying. They said aide to Lloyd George says millions are dying in Russia. And when they say Russia, in those days and still today, they meant the USSR, they called Russia, and Russia also was the term for Ukraine. But he exposed the famine. He was only a rookie journalist at the time. But what people don't realise is that he had a first-class degree in French and German from Aberystwyth University in Wales. He then got a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he read German and Russian language and Russian literature. And he was the college prizeman for 3 years running and left the Cambridge University in 1929 with a first-class degree. His parents wanted him to become an academic at a university, and in one of his letters back to his parents, he says, I don't want to end up in a second-class university like Manchester teaching classics for the rest of my life. I want to get out and meet the real people. Because he spoke Russian, he was able to get out and about. Gareth managed to secure an invite to Kharkiv to visit the tractor factory, by which time the journalists from Moscow weren't able to get out there. They had been banned in the same way the Ukrainians weren't able to get out of Ukraine. Gareth managed to get in. But what he wasn't supposed to do was to get off on the Russian-Ukrainian border. And what he did is he walked along the railway line in the snow of March of 1933, and he was stopping off in villages asking everybody what the conditions were. And they're saying, we've not had bread for 2 months. We were down to our last stock of beetroot. We're dying. Go down to Poldava. They're murdering 50% of the people there. And He got picked up by the secret police, but because of his visa, he was able to talk himself out of this because it had been provided by the Soviet Foreign Office. He was escorted to the German consulate in Kharkiv. He then writes in his diary notes, and he writes copious diary notes, and he writes in Kharkiv, queues of 7,000 queuing for bread, sort of waiting here overnight with forlorn hope. He came out and exposed the famine, and, well, afterwards he was banned from the Soviet Union, and this must have been a tremendous shock for him because he was an expert. He spoke fluent Russian. He was an expert on the politics and the literature, and he could no longer go. Gareth writes these diary notes, and these 3 pocket diaries, his journalist diaries, which I found in the suitcase, which I never looked at the time, now represents probably the only independent verification of arguably Stalin's greatest atrocity. Now, in one of these diaries, he writes Russification, Russian being taught in the schools, and he knew that they were getting rid of the intelligentsia of the Ukrainians, so he knew that it was not just about starving the peasants, and because they were closing the borders off. But he didn't know what was happening in the Kremlin and what's come out through the archives now. He could only see what he saw at the time. But he did note that Russian was being spoken and Ukraine. And one has to remember the capital of Ukraine was moved intentionally from Kyiv to Kharkiv so that the intellectuals who were still in Kyiv were not so influential out in Kharkiv. Gareth, on the other hand, not only was he meeting the upper echelons, the commissars, the deputy commissars, he was interviewing diplomats, he was interviewing playwrights in Moscow, but also he was meeting the common person. So he was able to understand what was happening, not what he was being told, and not what he was actually being able to see it for himself. He stayed when he was walking along, when he went to the Ukraine in 1933, he filled his rucksack full of food, which could be bought with foreign currency from Torgsan shops in Moscow. So he went along and he stayed in villages' houses on the floor, and he saw the children with their swollen stomachs through lack of food, and he was able to speak to the villagers. They were telling them, he was being told about the fabled kulaks, the rich farmers who were being sent away for owning just a cow, one single cow. They were hardly rich peasants. But Gareth was able to talk to these people, and they basically had no food left at all. They didn't have any food to sow for the next year. So Gareth... It's difficult to be a reporter, but he came back and he reported what he saw. And what Russia wanted was to have new factories and new technologies, whether it be car plants or steelworks. And in order to pay for that, they had to sell on the open market. Now, the problem was for the Soviets is because of the Depression, they had to sell even more wheat in order to get the same amount because the price of wheat has completely fallen. But I don't think that is part of the case, and I am not an expert on that matter. I can talk to you about Gareth, but I'm not able to give you a definitive answer on that, I'm afraid. For instance, I went to a fasting banquet for the Holodomor commemorations in 2007 in Winnipeg. And it struck me that I was sat on the top table with these survivors, and there was just a couple of grapes and a couple of biscuits. And I just noticed that after the meal, they took the grapes and the biscuits and they put them in their handbags because it was... because of the problems they've had in the past. They were telling me stories of, The reason they liked that I could come and talk about this is because they never dared, because they had relatives in Ukraine, or they should not have been in Canada because they said they were Polish and not Ukrainian, and they were worried that they would be deported. And I had an empathy with these survivors. Sadly, very few remain. I think it's probably important for the Ukrainians themselves, for their own history, to have this living testimony whilst it's still about, because it won't be these old ladies and maybe one or two old men won't be here, and they are the only survivors, and that is what is going to be important, and it's important for the Ukrainian national identity. Eugene Lyons was the UPI, the United Press correspondent, who arrived in the Soviet Union in 1924 as a communist sympathizer and left disillusioned in, I believe, 1934. He wrote his memoirs in 1937, and he states, he writes about Gareth Jones's exposure and how the Moscow coterie of journalists colluded together to throw down Jones and deny the fact that there was a famine, because they wanted to cover a show trial, and it was in their professional interest to denigrate Gareth in order to have their own look after their own professional needs of covering a trial. Without Gareth, the Holodomor would not have been so well documented in the West. The British had information in the Public Records Office, but Gareth's evidence is independent Western verification. And we still have these diaries, which have now been given to the National Library of Wales, and they are one of their treasured collections.